Hi, and welcome to Freshwaves. I'm your host, Bren Masson. Today we're speaking with Cecilia Omole, and she is a public policy leader and a fascinating human being. Hi, Cecilia, and welcome to Freshwaves.
Hi, Bren. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you. We were speaking with Pauline from the BPW, Business and Professional Women Organization, and she highly recommended you and said, wow, our newest member is just so cool. You've got to interview her. So here I am.
Excellent. Yes, and I must give a big shout out to Pauline as well. She's also a wonderful human being. So thank you, Pauline.
Yeah, she certainly is. I come from a family of givers, I would say. They're volunteers. My dad has the Queen's Jubilee Order of Philanthropy, and we've always given back. And I say to my kids, I've been saying it since they were little, what have you done for the greater good today? And it's a great question because I often think that it's not just enough for us to do for ourselves. We need to do for the world around us as well. We have a civic duty. We have a duty to each other. And a duty is just a living being on this planet to be a part of the planet, not just living on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about you. How did you end up being a public policy leader?
Well, it's a very interesting question, a very interesting story. For me personally, my kind of trajectory in terms of career and studies has not been a linear path, so to speak, although I've had kind of a common approach to kind of things that I've been interested in, and so that has not deviated too much. So in terms of my origin story, I kind of have to start off when I was in high school. I actually did the International Baccalaureate program, which is kind of an accelerated education program that's offered across different schools. It's kind of at an international standard. And so they basically give us high school students more advanced coursework to help us prepare for university. And so actually we end up being able to get some extra university credits when we complete the program when we graduate from high school. So I actually start off doing that. But while I was still in high school, I actually, had a kind of inkling and an interest in the United Nations. I'd kind of seen, some things on TV and things like that and some books. And so I found out that there was actually a kind of model UN club that existed at my local university. And I was interested in it. However, I wasn't sure whether I would be able to participate because I was still in high school. I think I was about 15 or 16 years old. And so I said, you know what? I have nothing to lose. Let me just email the club and see if they would be interested in taking on a very keen high school student. So I emailed them, and to my surprise, they actually allowed me to join the club. I initially just asked them if I could kind of just, listen in on one of their meetings and kind of see how things go, but they actually invited me to become a full member. And so I was very excited about that. So I started attending their meetings, and then eventually I actually ended up being able to participate in some of the mock UN conferences. So Model UN is basically a concept of mock UN conferences and mock UN meetings that are basically developed for very keen and interested university students. So they have them within different universities in Canada and all over the world. It's kind of a global program that exists. And so I had the luck of being able to participate at the Queen's University Model UN with the university club that I had joined. I believe I was representing Mozambique. And so I actually have a photo of myself, standing at the podium, representing Mozambique as a very young and keen high schooler, surrounded by these university students. And so that's kind of how my, international interest kind of began. And so from high school, I went and pursued an honors Bachelor of Arts in Economics at Carleton University. And I did a concentration in international political economy and a minor in French, because I actually grew up in Ottawa, but I was born in Winnipeg. And so when my parents and my siblings and I moved to Ottawa, my dad was like, it's probably a good idea for you guys to learn French because, for example, if you want to work in the public service, it would be an advantage for you to speak both English and French. So I took up that advice. I took it very seriously, and I did a lot of my coursework actually in French. And so when I went to do my undergraduate degree, although I did economics, I also tagged on a minor in French just to kind of force myself to maintain my French proficiency, which I had gathered in grade 7 and grade 8 and throughout high school. And so I did study international economics more or less, but then I had my minor in French to kind of force me to maintain my proficiency and my level of understanding, speaking, writing, and reading comprehension. So I did that, and I really loved economics. It's very interesting to me. I'm a very analytical person by nature. So strangely enough, I also got very lucky as well while I was in undergrad because my dad let me know about this federal student work experience program. And so I don't know if it still exists, but at the time they had this kind of program that offered, university students the opportunity to get kind of government experience. And so we were in Ottawa at the time. And so my dad was like, hey, you should apply to this and see, maybe you'll get selected to, get some work experience under your belt working in the federal government. And I was selected. I got a position. And so I actually started my kind of public service career at the Canada School of Public Service while I was still pursuing my undergraduate degree. And so that actually really set me up for success because by the time I moved forward and did my master's degree in public and international affairs at York University, I had already gotten a few years of federal work experience under my belt. So when it came time, for example, to apply for internships during graduate school, I had a lot of options on my plate. So I would say, that's more or less my origin story. I know that's kind of what I've studied. And then, I've done a number of things throughout my career. I spent some time in the federal government, and I went to do my master's degree here in Toronto. Then I ended up doing an internship in Washington, D.C., because I thought to myself, hey, you know what? I could do an internship in the Ontario government. I could do that. Or let me challenge myself and see if I can actually secure something internationally. Because I'm like, you know what? If I'm studying international policy topics, I should probably try and see if I can get some international experience. So I ended up applying to the Washington Center, which has an academic scholarship and an academic internship program. So basically, you get to intern in, a small NGO within Washington, D.C. for 4 months, as well as, volunteering. So I did teach English as well. And they also have some courses that you can take if you're interested. So I took one in business, international business. So from that point, I also, did other things while I was in grad school. I was able to present at the European Consortium for Political Research. I was doing some research as a graduate assistant. And then when I graduated from my master's degree, I ended up getting back into the workforce. And so I started off at various areas in and outside of government. And I've currently landed in an area outside of government, but I'm still working in public policy, which is my main area of interest. And so that's kind of where it brings me to today, actually, is I've always been kind of interested in international affairs and things of that nature, but I've always kind of maintained my keen interest in public policy matters. And of course, interfacing in public service has always been really interesting to me, as well as volunteering. To your earlier point, I think giving back to your community is really important. It's something that I've done since high school, actually, and it's something I continue to do to this day.
Wow. Well, that's a really impressive CV.
Thank you.
I mean, I've got to go back to when you were 15. I mean, I think when I was 15, I was wondering what band was coming to the school dance on Friday. I can't even imagine being interested in foreign policy. And I was impressed with the kids who were running for class president or school president, and I would often look at them and say, why? But I mean, it was a club like any other club, I was in the choir and the band, and other people were doing politics. But for you to take such a broader picture at such a young age. That's incredible. I mean, were your parents into the international scene and into the United Nations and what was going on there?
No, not at all, actually. I mean, I'm a first generation Canadian, so maybe that's part of it. Like I'm, first generation Canadian of parents who are immigrants from Africa. And so, I've always had a very strong interest in what's happening in the continent. And, I still have, family that lives there as well. And so perhaps that's probably where my kind of interest was piqued. Sort of just having a big and a deep love for Africa in general. But I think generally speaking, I think I was actually very lucky because my parents are very supportive, for myself and my brother and my sister. They've always encouraged us to pursue our dreams and to go for where we're interested in things. And so, yeah, it may be a little bit shocking for a high schooler to be emailing a university to join their Model UN club to discuss foreign policy matters. But to me, it wasn't really that strange. When I told my parents, it wasn't that strange to them. They were kind of like, that's cool. Yeah, go for it. You can do it. So I think for me, I've been very, very lucky that I have a very strong support system at home. And I really credit my success and where I am today, honestly, to my parents and the supportive environment that they created for myself and for my siblings at home to kind of just always be curious, bet on yourself, and just go for it.
Well, it's admirable on a number of fronts, but anyone at a university who gets an application like yours from a high school student that is so keen would be foolish to turn it down. I mean, they should be encouraging young people to get involved at the earliest age possible. And then your understanding of the world becomes so much more global. And I think so many of us end up with a very provincial upbringing. We're really stuck in our, grassroots community, which is, I think, where we're supposed to be when we're very little. But as we get older, I hear parents say to me, oh, my kid wants to take a year off of high school and travel around Europe. And I say, let them. They need to do that. Oh, they want to go to Australia for a year and then do university. Go for it. As long as they're not sitting in your basement playing video games, let them go and see the world, because I think it makes them a better person and it makes the world a better place because we're more connected to the global picture of the world.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And I think even just my experience working and, being overseas, so to speak, interning in Washington, D.C. really opened my eyes to, how things work differently in different countries and even interacting with other communities, right? So, for example, I interned at Partners for Democratic Change. I think they've since changed the name of the NGO, but I interned there in their Middle East, North Africa portfolio, and I learned a ton of things, just kind of soaking up the conversations, being part of the team that was helping to receive international delegations that were doing policy work with the organization, being in the DC ecosystem and attending policy talks at the various think tanks that were in kind of the area that I was working in, being able to present research at the European Consortium for Political Research in Vienna when I was in grad school. I feel like all of those experiences have really broadened my perspective on the world. And I think getting that exposure kind of relatively early in my career really helped me to think differently about the world and not just focus on my immediate environment.
That's amazing. I mean, even the way that you so casually talk about all of those things.
Yeah.
Were you ever intimidated? Did you walk into one of these rooms and go, wow, what am I doing here?
Certainly. And I think, the idea of imposter syndrome is very real. I think even especially for women, it's certainly something I think a lot of us struggle with. Am I in the right room? Am I qualified to speak on this topic? Should I just shrink myself? Doubting yourself and things like that. I think certainly imposter syndrome is certainly something that can affect a lot of us. For myself personally, I think Yeah, certainly when I was younger and I was like in these rooms and things like that, I certainly, I was kind of second guessing myself sometimes, but I was very lucky that I have had very supportive supervisors and mentors throughout my career that have always encouraged me to, speak up and own your place in the room and own your place at the table and, to feel confident contributing to the conversation. But certainly I will acknowledge that, yes, when I was younger, I would certainly say that imposter syndrome was certainly more of a struggle. Not so much nowadays, but certainly when I was younger, I would definitely say I was a bit intimidated in terms of some of the rooms that I was in. Because I was like literally just the youngest person at the table, right? So, I mean, for example, like the Model UN at the Queen's University, I was literally the youngest person there. But, I went prepared to represent the country that had been given in my file. And I just did the best of my ability, right? So I think also owning that confidence of, yeah, I know my stuff and I know what I'm talking about. I feel like it really makes a difference in terms of overcoming that imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was the ratio of men to women in some of these rooms?
Let me think.
Like, was it one of those things where you walked in and there was a spattering of women and most of the people were men?
Honestly, if I look back, I feel like it was pretty evenly distributed, like, especially when it comes to kind of international policy conversations and like international development matters. I find it's fairly equal in the room. Like it wasn't overly dominated by one gender or the other. Because I think a lot of people generally are very interested in international policy work and development in general. And I have found, at least in my experience, the rooms have been pretty evenly split.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the policies that you've been involved in?
Wow, that's a great question. I've done so many different things, like in terms of just working in different sectors, like, for example, when I was at Treasury Board Secretariat in Ontario, I worked on the risk management file, so kind of helping provincial agencies report on risks that they were dealing with to Treasury Board, Management Board of Cabinet. When I was at Ministry of Health, I would say a couple of the big files that I worked on were related to pharmaceuticals. And so when I was at Ministry of Health, I was the pharmaceuticals intergovernmental health policy lead. So I was actually very lucky to have the opportunity to take over that file from my manager at the time, who had gotten promoted to the management level. And so I got to actually work on the Canada-Ontario bilateral agreement for an emergency treatment fund, which was essentially a pot of money that the federal government was offering to the provinces and territories to help support the opioids crisis. This was more kind of around the mid 2010s when it was really in the news a lot, and it was a big crisis across Canada, and governments were trying to figure out how to manage this health crisis. So I was able to lead that work and finalize that bilateral agreement, which provided the government of Ontario with a pot of money to help deal with that issue. And then I think the probably one of the bigger files that I worked on too, which was also at Ministry of Health, was the National Pharmacare file. So I think some of your listeners may be familiar, but there's been recent announcement about it being kind of finalized. I think the legislation received royal assent, and so there's an actual, I think, plan to implement a form of national pharmacare. I don't believe it's a comprehensive program that will cover a large suite of drugs, but I think it's a first step in terms of providing coverage to Canadians so that they don't need to really pay out of pocket. That one I think was a really interesting file because I was working in intergovernmental health policy, I actually had to work with my counterparts across Canada to basically come up with a position for what national pharmacare should look like as it pertains to each jurisdiction's perspective. So Ontario basically held the pen on a couple of reports which I wrote. And so I had to go to, my counterpart in Quebec and PEI and BC and say, hey, what are your government's perspectives on national pharmacare? What are the principles that should guide the federal government if they are going to move ahead with this? And so it was actually a really interesting file. I got basically to cut my teeth in terms of negotiation skills. And so, it's like dealing with Quebec, they have a very particular perspective on things, especially as it pertains to federalism and things of that nature. There's a lot of cultural sensitivities as well, just given the history of Quebec versus, British Columbia or PEI or even the territories, for example. So it was very interesting to work with these other jurisdictions to kind of pull together these two reports that went to the Council of the Federation, which is basically the meeting place for all of Canada's premiers to kind of talk about a broad range of public policy issues. So I think there's a table for transportation and for health and for things of that nature. And so those two reports went to the health table. And so there was a discussion, and we ended up having a kind of formalized position on, what the provinces and territories think should be captured in a national pharmacare program. And so it was nice to see that, several years later, it's kind of been finalized. There's, a first step that we can see now in Canada. So I think it's a positive thing to see, that potentially there could be something more comprehensive in the future. But it's nice to see kind of the fruits of labor that I did, a few years ago to finally see, okay, there's been an announcement for some program to be started.
That's amazing. I'm just sitting here in awe. I hope the listeners are enjoying this as much as I am, because it's fascinating to talk to someone so young and who has just really gone out and conquered the world. Okay. We have to take our first break here on Freshwaves. I'm your host, Bren Masson. Today we're speaking with Cecilia Omole, and we're talking about all kinds of things. Coming up after the break, we'll get into how she got into the BPW, people that are very familiar to us here on Freshwaves. We'll be right back, so stay tuned. Hi, we're back on Freshwaves. Today we're speaking with Cecilia Omole, and we're talking about public policy and her origin story and how she ended up being where she is. And of course, if you're a regular listener to Fresh Waves on Sunday morning at 9, you know that we just finished our organ donation awareness shows that we run every April for the month of April. And one of the things that we were talking about is policy changes and research going on in the subject of organ donation, whether we should have opt-in or opt-out programs. Right now we have opt-in programs in Ontario, opt-out in Nova Scotia. So hopefully, and maybe, Cecilia will get involved in one of those projects coming up soon, because there's a very interesting discussion happening right now. Now, I came to get in contact with you, Cecilia, through Pauline at BPW, which is Business and Professional Women. They're an international as well as provincial organization. They have different groups all over the country and internationally. They also hold 2 seats on the UN, as far as I know. So how did you get involved with BPW?
Actually, I think, if I recall correctly, I think I was looking for additional ways to get involved with volunteering kind of locally with women's issues and women's rights advocacy. And so I came across the BPW Canada website, and there was a piece where you can kind of contact them for more information. So I just sent a quick note just expressing that I was interested in volunteering and getting involved. I heard back, and I've kind of been involved ever since, I believe, September of last year.
That's not very long, but that's still long enough to know the organization and get going on some of the initiatives that they're putting forward. Are you participating in some of those?
Yes, although I've only been involved for a few months, so to speak, there's a lot of work that's being done, not just within Canada, but also on the international stage. Within Canada, specifically, within our North Toronto chapter, we have often put together, fundraisers. We had one a few months ago for a Thunder Bay, I believe, Healing Lodge to help support Indigenous women. And we're very close to those causes as well. But of course, we try to amplify the voice of women, not just at the local level, but also at the international level as well. And so we're often working with our international sisters. So there's a number of other BPW organizations across the world that kind of flow into the BPW International organization.
Okay, now from your North Toronto branch, can you get involved in those projects that are more international?
Absolutely. So I believe I spoke with Pauline about it, and she had mentioned to me that there is this annual UN Commission on the Status of Women conference that happens every year, and that BPW Canada specifically has a seat at the table at the Economic and Social Council. And so I said, okay, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know that, that was a possibility, especially for a nonprofit organization that's local here in Toronto and in Canada. So she said, yeah, actually, there's usually an annual call out for members who are interested in participating and going to the UN headquarters to be at those meetings and at those consultations. So she said, okay, stay tuned for the call. It usually happens in, around November, December time period. And so, yeah, I was very lucky. I saw the call out. I applied. I got accepted. And I was part of the delegation that went to the 69th UN Commission on the Status of Women, which took place at the UN headquarters in New York City in March. I believe we were about 20 women. So these are women that are part of the other chapters across Canada that are part of the BPW Canada organization. And so we kind of formed the Canadian delegation. We were the BPW Canada representatives that were at the meeting. And then, of course, we were also there with our international sisters who were part of a whole bunch of different clubs from all over the world within South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, United States, other parts of North America and the Caribbean. And so it was a really great opportunity to even just meet other women who are also as passionate about, pushing forward for, social and economic independence and power for women and advocacy for women's rights as well.
So do you think that the status of women is improving overall from what you see when you go to these forums?
I think it really depends where you are in the world. Because I was actually reading a recent report. The UN, I don't know if you're familiar, but the UN has an Agenda 2030, which is essentially the roadmap to kind of make a number of changes in a variety of different areas. So, for example, the 17 areas are kind of framed as sustainable development goals, and they touch on a variety of different themes. So, for example, for the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the focus primarily was Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is gender equality. So pushing forward in moving women's rights ahead. But according to their 2024 report, if I'm not mistaken, on the SDGs, we're actually seeing some regression in some areas and some of the targets related to gender equality. So actually, I think it really depends on where you are in the world. I think, if you ask a woman in certain parts of the world where there's, maybe a lot of war or famine, it might be a different question than asking a woman in a developing country, for example. I would like to be optimistic and think that things are generally moving in the right direction. But if I look at the 2024 SDG report that touched on, goal number 5, which is talking about gender equality, it seems to suggest that, there is still a lot of work to be done.
I know that on International Women's Day and things like that. There's a lot more social media buzz about it now than there was when I was younger, which to me seems like a good thing. But I think you're right. It depends on what part of the world that you're in. There are some parts of the world where it just hasn't seemed to touch as much as it should, I think.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think, looking at the SDG report from last year, it seems to suggest that broadly things are, there's a lot of work to be done. I think they even mentioned that, a number of the goals are at risk of not being achieved by 2030. So I think certainly depending on where a woman is located, that can influence her perspective and her experience in the world. And so I certainly agree. I think, there's still a lot of work to be done. I think I attended one of the sessions at the Commission on the Status of Women that featured the Nordic ministers. So this were the ministers of gender affairs and gender equality from countries such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and I believe the Faroe Islands and Iceland. And even though they have actually been one of the forefront leaders on moving gender equality ahead, they've actually been very progressive. Like they've had a lot of gender equality policies that have been very transformational very early on. I think even going back to kind of the 70s and even the 80s, they were very progressive in women's rights matters. But even those ministers mentioned that, they're also cautiously optimistic because they're starting to see some areas where there's a risk of us moving in the wrong direction. A good example of this is kind of the resurgence of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So, now that we have all these new technologies like artificial intelligence and deep fakes and things like that, it's, online abuse of women is a real issue, especially when we're talking about women who, are pushing for human rights in certain countries or are pushing for, political rights or, things of that nature. They often are subjected to a lot of abuse, not just physically when they're, out there protesting and advocating, but also when they're, at home and they're on their computer, they're receiving, often a barrage of abuse from kind of anonymous avatars, right? So how do we as an international community get ahead of that and ensure that women can feel safe to express their perspectives and their opinions in the world without worrying about being abused, right? Because it also deters women from being full participants politically as well, for example, or even wanting to participate in human rights issues. Is if they're worried about their safety and being abused online, or worrying about somebody stalking them, for example, it's something we certainly need to take very seriously.
Mm-hmm. And it's sad for me when I hear about things like this, because somehow in my brain I thought we'd come so much farther. And then when you hear some of the stories, it's I don't know, it makes me sad, because I think that there is a lot of work left to be done. And I don't want to bring up my kids in a state of fear, but they still have to be aware. And in order to bring them that awareness, in with it comes a modicum of fear. And it's a good, healthy fear. They have to be afraid sometimes.
Yes, I think we're certainly living in a very different world now where, it's kind of tech first, right? Everybody's on their phone, everybody's connected on the internet. And so, what would have been maybe something that people would only need to worry about in the physical world, you now also need to worry about abuse in the virtual world as well, right? And so coming with that is also reputational risk, in addition to, actual threats of violence that can sometimes actually happen in the real world.
I think people just feel once they're on their devices that they're just so disconnected that they can say things and do things that they normally wouldn't do if they were standing face to face with someone.
I agree. I think there's a certain level of, I don't know how to frame it, but I think, a faceless avatar probably feels a lot more strength and more power to say whatever they want because they feel like they can remain anonymous versus somebody confronting you in person, right? That it's a different type of interaction. And so I agree. I think the faceless avatars of the internet world feel like they can get away with anything. And I think that encourages them to be kind of ruthless in their attacks on individuals and in particular on women.
So how is policy going to change that? Is policy not thought of so many times as just a piece of paper? And unless it's enforced, well, it's nice. We have the legislation or we have this piece of policy and the policy says, be nice, but no one does.
Yeah, I think when it comes to policy and generally public policy work, a lot of it is, it's certainly not an instantaneous solution. Certainly, it often starts off with an idea, right? An idea of we want to do things differently. And then from there you think about, okay, how can we do things differently? And then you move forward into, okay, who do we need to engage to get things to change? And so you have to kind of not only put, physical policies together, whether it's, through an actual document or, pushing through other instruments such as legislation and regulation, but you also have to bring people along as well, because often it involves kind of a cultural shift as well. Mm-hmm. Because you can't really have success, in my perspective, in public policy work without having buy-in and having, your supporters of what you're trying to do, because otherwise you often end up with a lot of opposition, and it makes it very difficult to enact change. If you don't have any buy-in and you don't have any allies to move your advocacy work forward, it can become almost impossible to actually make any changes happen. And so certainly when we talk about public policy work, it can take years. It can even take decades depending on what you're working on. And so it's certainly not an instantaneous area of work. It's often very laborious, and it requires a lot of, negotiation and consensus building and kind of bringing people along to kind of get them to see why what you're proposing would be beneficial for the society at large. Mm-hmm. And it's not easy to accomplish. I would certainly say it's not easy. Oftentimes in public policy work, you are dealing with those kind of angry stakeholders, right, who don't really want to hear what you're talking about, or they'll be very kind of adversarial or very obstructionist to what you're trying to achieve. And so you have to kind of, get to a place where you can kind of find some common ground where, is there an area where we both mutually agree and kind of push forward on that piece? Or oftentimes it's also a case of walking back your proposal and kind of starting, at the foundation and moving at a slower pace. So starting with those kind of, as we often say in policy, like those quick wins. So can we get a small win here that will move us closer to our desired end state? And then kind of keep going in that direction, as opposed to trying to do this grandiose transformational change with a lot of pushback.
Well, that makes sense. That seems to be a good way of approaching it. I mean, it's kind of, to me, I look at it and think, is it which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do we try and change the society and the way society thinks and talks? And, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I remember being in situations where we were talking about the girls in the office and how we were going out or something. And another woman from a different department said to me, "You can't talk about women like that." And I thought, like, what? She said, "You sound like your father talking about the girls in the office. They're not girls in the office. They're women in the workplace." And I thought, yeah, they are. But I didn't mean any disrespect. But in the way we speak and the way we use language, we depict a scenario. We tell the story. And if we're telling the story in a way that doesn't support the very gender that we are, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Yeah, I think, language is so important. So that idea of, inclusivity is really critical as well. And I think, a lot of things that help inform good policy work is having kind of gender-based analysis as well. So understanding the differences between the different communities and understanding where the needs are, and as opposed to just making a generalized assumption about what, maybe what women need, for example, but actually having data and informed information conversations with individuals to really understand what are the actual salient issues, and not working off of assumptions. I think in policy, that's a really important part of our work. It's kind of not really moving forward with assumptions. You have to really challenge your assumptions to make sure you're not, biased in your work.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in that sense, society and changes to societal attitudes pushes you to make the policies that help that to come into play. Is that correct?
I think it certainly helps inform and influence the work. I think sometimes you certainly will see things in society and you say, okay, this needs to change because this is not what we want to be doing. And so that can kind of influence things. But yeah, the chicken and the egg question is really interesting. Is it, what comes first? Oftentimes we'll have, those mavericks, so to speak, that really are the ones that push forward for change when when nobody else was having those conversations, for example. Just thinking of the early women's rights movements, right? Those ladies were change makers. They received a lot of resistance when they were doing things. So it's hard to say, is it the chicken or the egg? I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of push and pull in terms of when we're making changes. I think you need a little bit of both. It's hard to say what comes first.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that when my daughter is an engineer, and she graduated from U of T, and she was approached by a group of women in engineering, and asking if, she wanted to join, and telling her about all the ways that they support women in engineering, especially in civil engineering and, things like that, where it's a lot of construction and women are still underrepresented. And she said no. And I said, what do you mean no? Why wouldn't you take the help of this organization? Why wouldn't you become a part of it and an advocate for it? I mean, I'm all, let's go. This is great. Women in engineering. And she's like, I don't want to be a woman in engineering. I want to be an engineer. Mm. And she just stopped me dead in my tracks. I had never considered it from that point of view before. I'm looking at this diminutive little thing who's a woman going out into a very man world. Let's drop concrete and see if it breaks. And she didn't want to be a woman in engineering. She wanted to be an engineer. What a valid point.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think, certainly when we're talking about women's rights and women's advocacy, that's I think at the core of what we're trying to push for is that equality, right? Not just saying I'm a woman engineer or I'm a female engineer. I'm an engineer and I deserve a place at the table as well.
Right.
But I think certainly it's still very helpful to have your advocates. And I think a lot of these women's rights groups, such as BPW, are very helpful in pushing the narrative forward and pushing change forward, because when you amplify voices, you can grab the attention of government and grab the attention of other influential decision makers and tell them and get them to, hey, listen to us. We've got something interesting to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it comes on all levels, doesn't it? There's a place for the people standing on the sidewalk with a sandwich board and a flag and saying, here we are, and walking in a big parade downtown, here we are. And there's also a place for the people who are quietly in the background writing policy.
Yeah, I agree. You need a bit of both. You need team players on both sides. I agree with that, certainly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what is in the future for you? You're now in the BPW. You've been to all these amazing places. I went to the UN in Geneva, and I was just awed standing on the sidewalk even and looking at all the flags and saying, this is such an amazing place. It's inspiring. Just standing there outside is inspiring. So you're on the inside. What's next for you?
I don't know. I mean, at least for me, career-wise, I've always kind of been very curious and interested in different things. And I think certainly my interest with the UN and volunteering will continue. What that will look like in the future, I don't know. But certainly I look forward to continuing to volunteer with BPW, and hopefully attend some future meetings at the UN as well as part of future delegations, just to kind of continue to push the conversation forward. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm excited for the future. I don't know exactly what it will hold, but I'm excited to continue to work with BPW Canada.
Okay. And career-wise, are you just, have you got some interesting projects in your sights or what?
Career-wise, I'm not sure. Certainly interested in continuing to work in public policy, and that's always been my area of interest. So I think I'm going to continue to do that. And then, of course, just probably continue my volunteering as well. I think it gives me a nice balance. So I kind of get the practical experience on the job at work. And then, of course, when I'm volunteering, getting to be part of these conversations is always very interesting for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, we look forward to your continued support of BPW and having you at all these delegations and things, because I think you have a very strong voice. I like the way you present yourself, and I think you're doing us proud.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate even just the opportunity to speak with you today and to share my story. I deeply appreciate that.
Well, it's inspiring for young people, I think, to hear women, especially like you, for young women who are wondering what they want to do with their lives. The more options we can give them, the better off they are. They can make choices that they might not have ever known were available to them.
That's very true. And I think, I look back at one of my favorite quotes by the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, which he said, "You are never too young to lead, and you should never doubt your capacity to triumph where others have not." And so for me, that kind of is something that I think about and reflect on often. It's like what I had mentioned earlier too. It's like the idea of betting on yourself, right? Like even if something seems scary or you don't even think you have a chance at it, whether it's volunteering or career-wise or what have you, go ahead and do it. If it scares you, go ahead and do it and, see what happens. You might have some success with it. Don't, focus too much on the imposter syndrome, I would say. I would encourage any young people who are listening, don't listen to that little imposter voice in your head. Go for it. Try it. Because at the end of the day, you'll still learn something regardless. So I think, I would encourage everybody, you're never too young to lead. Just go for it.
Yeah, I think those are great words and words of encouragement. It's a time of year in the spring here where kids are making their decision at which way they're going in university, what they're thinking of, and maybe they didn't even know that they could go into public policy or get a master's degree in something that they've never even dreamed of, and do some traveling and see the world while they're doing it. Exactly.
Anything's possible, I would say. Anything is possible. If someone had told me when I was, 15, 16, emailing the Model UN Club at the university that I would, someday have the opportunity to intern in Washington, D.C., present research at a European Consortium for Political Research in Vienna, Austria, have an opportunity to be a delegate at the United Nations, I would have said there is no way that was going to happen. But here I am.
But look at you go. Well, that's the thing that I think is the most important thing about being a guidance counselor at a high school level, is to give kids the opportunity to explore anything and everything, and obviously there are barriers that get in the way in our lives. But if you go at life with the intention of doing the best you can at whatever it is you do, you never know what can happen.
Exactly.
Because you yourself said that some of the things in your life you've been lucky enough almost to stumble upon.
Yes, I would certainly say, for me, honestly, like I mentioned earlier, my career path has not been linear at all. A lot of it is of course, hard work, but coupled with that is a little sprinkle of a little bit of luck and a little bit of being in the right room at the right time, and also a little bit of meeting the right people at the right time as well, who have, have become mentors to me or who have become advocates for me. I think that makes all the difference in the world.
You somehow seem to have this little edge of fearlessness. And I mean that in the best of ways, because I think sometimes, especially for women, it's our fear of perhaps sticking our necks out too far, or, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to do that. There's other things I'm going to do. And maybe we need to start training our young women to just go for it in a really big way. Why not? What's the worst that can happen?
I agree. And honestly, I have to again credit my parents who instilled that fearlessness in myself and in my siblings. Like, to them, anything is possible, right? Like, if a door even looks like it's closed, doesn't matter, try anyways. You don't know, you'll never know unless you try, right? And so I think that fearlessness for me personally comes from kind of my upbringing. And I would certainly encourage young girls, women, I say the same for my cousins and my little cousins and things like that. Like, just go for it, you know. Of course, have a plan when you're doing things, right? And, you know, don't do things that are too crazy whereby you might put yourself in a precarious, you know, situation, whether financial or otherwise. But, you know, bet on yourself, right? Like, my main message to them has always been to bet on yourself. Try something different, challenge yourself, and continue to learn and grow. Because that's how you really develop as an individual, is you need to continue to challenge yourself, put yourself in kind of uncomfortable situations where you're going to grow, whether it's a stretch assignment at work or whether it's, you know, learning something new, taking a course, or, you know, joining a different club or a group and volunteering and learning and interacting with different individuals or things of that nature, traveling, whatever it may be. Just continually to push yourself to do the tough work, to try the hard things.
Well, I can't agree with you more, and I think that's a great place to end the show today. Those words of encouragement. Thank you so much for joining us, Cecilia. We've really enjoyed having you on the show, and we hope that you keep us up to date with what you're doing and let us know what's transpired from your trips around the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciated the opportunity to share my story and to hopefully encourage others as well.
Perfect. Well, you've been listening to Fresh Waves. I'm your host, Bren Masson, and we will speak to you again next week on Fresh Waves. Take care, everyone, and have a fabulous week.